which is fine. But in conclusion to my tiny speech, I felt that it was really interesting to see about these different ways of making moral judgments, but probably having studied it, but I did wonder, is it just those 3, or are there another 5 or another 10 different ways you can have? In which case, why are we looking at just those 3? And what I formulated while I was listening was that I probably make my moral judgments, or I want to, based on the needs or desires of me, those around me, and the greater environment, and balancing those things. And that would be like rather than going, sometimes I'm going to use consequentialism, sometimes I'm going to use sometimes I use virtue ethics. I'm going to take those 3 things and I'm going to try and balance them as best I can. And that's how I'll make my judgment.
Yeah, I mean, if you prefer to think in terms of other kinds of potential theory, then the same basic principles would apply, in terms of trying to use that other model in order to imbue objectivity into your judgments.
Imbue what, sorry?
Imbue objectivity into your judgments. Yeah, so if you're thinking in terms of what was it you said? Your own interests and those of others and those of the community. Was it those?
The greater environment.
Greater environment, right? Yeah. I mean, all those struck me as that they could be interpreted either consequentially or in terms of principles, but maybe it's just a different way of breaking up or analysing the material. But these 3 theories are this is just the result of what Western philosophical analysis has done with ethics, and most other possible principles that certainly ones I've come across could be put under one of these 3 headings in one way or another, or made subject to them. But obviously, this is just a model, and you can come up with a different model. That's great.
May I suggest there is potentially one other one that I'd be interested to see if they relate to. It's Hume didn't call it non-cognitivism, but we could just read the quick overview. Hume argued that the right action is that for which a true judge, i.e. one who adopts a stable and general perspective on the world, is going to feel approbation. He feels a positive or pro-attitude towards an action being right because he adopts a stable and general perspective on the world. What Hume believed is that Aristotle rather assumes that what motivates a moral action is reason, and what Hume comes in with is that he says, no, if you look at what reason is and what passion, which he called desire, is, you'll see that reason can never motivate or suppress an action, because of course the suppression of an action is itself an action. So this sort of ties in with Lakoff and Johnson, or maybe Johnson and Lakoff tie in with this. Often the argument against this, then, well, if everything is just desire, so where does morality come from? He says that your desires are the driving force of your actions, but it's reason that guides them.
Yeah, I mean, the trouble with that, if you look further into Hume, is that he's also a determinist. So he thinks we're driven by our passions, whereas rather than being able to take responsibility for them, as it were, in another sense. But also, Hume and Aristotle, I would say, that perspective you just articulated there is a virtue ethics perspective. It's just a slightly different one from Aristotle's. But whether you understand virtue ethics in terms of getting into better desire,
right,
or getting into better belief patterns, it's just 2 different ways of conceptualising interrelated.
Yeah, that's really helped me. Ding. Yeah.
But either way, the assumption is you get to be the right sort of person, then you'll make the right decisions.
Yeah. Yep, got that.
So what you said about human desire and being driven by our passions, that means that we therefore can't take responsibility for them in Hume's approach.
In Hume's approach.
Yeah. Same as Sam Harris.
Yeah, but in a sense, again, I think this comes back to this concern I've got about ultimate responsibility and proximate responsibility, because I think it strikes me that ultimately that seems quite reasonable in the sense that how do you take responsibility for your desires, your passions? Well, you must have a desire to do that. And where does that desire come from? And it's like...
Sure, well, I'm not trying to provide an ultimate answer of any kind. That would be a metaphysical answer. So I would just back off from that. That sort of claim with it.
I don't know why. I find this thing about ultimate responsibility really difficult just to back off from. From an emotional point of view, I find it quite problematic. I kind of want to say, yeah, maybe it is just enough for me to say, no, you can't say that, rather than, or you can't support that, rather than saying that's wrong. Maybe that's what how I need to deal with it.
Yeah, that's the difference between agnosticism and negative metaphysics.
Yeah.
Just coming back to the justice thing, because I think that's worth pursuing a bit. That there are philosophical analysis of justice. There are three different main ways of talking about it. Yes, you can talk about justice as equality. So it's fair to give people equal amounts of resources, for example. Pay them the same amount, something of that kind, or pay them the same for the same work, whatever it is. Or justice as needs, so it's just to meet the needs of a disabled person by providing them with a wheelchair, even though it's more expensive, something like that. And the other one is desert, so it's just to give people a reward for working hard, or not for not working hard, etc. Yeah. So three main ways of thinking about justice, and I think again you could regard these as parts of the tools in the toolbox. That whenever we've got an actual situation to deal with where we have to make a judgment about fairness, these different conceptions of justice actually direct us towards certain kinds of objectivity but not others. So, there are obviously reasons for perhaps adopting a principle of promoting equality, but if you start being rigid about this, it's practically impossible to maintain equality in most senses of equality. I mean, maybe some sort of rough equality of opportunity is, in education, say, is realisable, but to give everybody the same amount of money in their bank accounts, for example, if you levelled it all out through taxation and grants tomorrow, then by the next day it would all be different again. So how would you actually make equality happen? But on the other hand, inequality, particularly gross inequality, produces negative social effects. There's a lot of evidence about this from studies of inequality in different societies, and the kinds of difficulties created in very unequal developing countries like Brazil, say, or compared to Scandinavian countries, which have had lots of benefits from relative equality. Or you can, but on the other hand, addressing people's needs. Obviously the various conditions at work there are that people have needs which need addressing, and that's part of the conditions of their lives. So you're very likely to produce conflict, for example, if people's basic needs are not met. If they don't have bread, then they're going to riot, for example. And then you also address certain conditions by giving people what they deserve, or at least what they feel they deserve. So there are, the scale they use when they work out what they think they deserve may be completely conventional in many cases. Why does more years of study, for example, in some sort of theory, not necessarily in practice, lead to higher pay? Why should that be the case? Well, I don't think there's any absolute reason why it should be the case, but there's a convention at work which we'd have to work with, you know, if you were deciding what to pay somebody in a particular circumstances. And I guess Kat has to deal with this in practice. But yeah, so you'd have to decide what kind of principle of justice to apply according to what would best address those conditions in the circumstances, and that in turn might lead you back to questions about, well, you know, what will be the consequences of applying it. What, you know, if you're using a principle of equality as a principle, how rigidly should you keep to that principle? How much does it help people to develop virtue? You know, so if you reward people, for example, for being virtuous, then that encourages them to develop more virtue. You know, so there's the feedback mechanisms. So I think that's a whole discussion about virtue could be it can be a development of the way in which I've been talking about ethical theories, but it's not. I don't think it's really about, or it doesn't need to be about how we get virtue or where it comes from. It's just about how we respond to that experience of feeling that there should be justice, and how we channel it, and what sort of form we choose to give it in the judgments we make about what's just.
I notice a bit of a kind of slump in my in my sort of enthusiasm, I suppose, in the sense that it's easy to end up feeling a bit pessimistic about things, isn't it? It's like, I mean, take the equality thing. I mean, I passionately feel that. It's like, you know, it seems blindingly obvious to me that the inequality in society is a major source of all kinds of social problems. And yet, if I was to play devil's advocate, you know, the studies done on Scandinavian countries compared to Brazilian countries, if I happen to be emotionally very committed to, you know, right-wing or neoliberal kind of politics, then I'd say, well, that's just association. There's no proof. You can't conclude anything from that. That's just, there's all kinds of confounding factors. Scandinavia is a very different country from Brazil. Just because there's inequality in one and not in the other, you can't. Yeah, it's just easy to get quite depressed, actually.
Still not got why you're depressed.
Because you kind of think, well, where do you gain any purchase? It's like, in terms of the kind of wider discussion, is fine for us here in this room because we all share similar kind of inclinations. You know. But when you come up against somebody who's deeply committed libertarian, then
where I find encouragement is in pieces of work like Steven Pinker's. There have been voices against, I think quite strong voices against his opinion, but that could also be the negativity bias kicking in itself. His book is arguably against the negativity bias. And there's a storm around the book a little bit, but I feel that there is evidence out there to suggest that we are gradually making moral progress.
Yeah, I think that's a reason to be optimistic. But yeah, you might not be able to convince someone whose views are so different from yours, but you know, you've just got to talk to people that you do know, and maybe you'll make a slight shift in their view.
I guess my concern, maybe my concern is actually as much to do with the fact that I may be completely wrong.
Well,
the libertarian may be the one that's right.
But
I'm coming at it because I'm loaded with my.
But what's right and wrong in that?
Again, it's like, I don't know. It just.
What feels right, Julian?
Let's give Tim a chance to get a word in.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean, as a whole, it sort of seems to make a lot of sense. It seems to sort of, I think it more or less integrates with the way I would perceive the world and make those judgments. I think naturally, in most cases, we would look at the sort of three areas of judgment and use them in an integrated way, just sort of instinctively almost. Either something feels right or it violates a principle, or you can see that it will have a bad consequence, and you sort of balance those things sort of almost implicitly. And this sort of sets out the sort of underpinnings of that, of why that is a reasonable thing to be doing. And you can see where someone's taken one extreme, and I think the middle way generally sort of seems to be saying that if you do anything to one extreme, you're going to run into trouble sooner or later. So as long as you're aware of the two ends, you can then find a way to navigate between them. And I think that's, just it seems relatively sensible as just a way of dealing with the universe in general. So from that perspective, I think it sort of resonates with the way I would look at the world. Whether it's, I think when you get to philosophy, you get to much more rigorously defending these positions than I would tend to do and tend to think about, which means this is a lot more in detail than I would have tried to articulate these thoughts. But having them sort of presented in this way is really useful and really helpful.
But does it fit with your experience of making moral decisions, do you think?
Yes, I think it does. I think because I can think of times when I have applied one or more of these things, whether it's I have a principle of doing this, or whether I have a rule of thumb, or whether I just gut feel because of the way I am. My gut feeling on a particular thing is this, and that's based on the virtue ethics of whether I am the right kind of person to make that decision. Because I haven't really considered the consequences explicitly. I've just sort of thought that feels right or that feels wrong. And other times you will just say, well, if I do that, therefore I think all these things will happen. Whereas if I do that, all these things will happen. And then you're weighing those up. And you sort of tend to do one based on... Well, I think generally, quite often you'll have a sort of preference order of them. If one of them doesn't come to a conclusive good feeling, if one doesn't feel right or wrong, then you think, right, okay, in that case, what can I apply to this situation to do the next step, to sort of look at the different things. I mean, in my work, a lot of it's done by principle, in that although you can't see why this is going to be a problem later, so you can't predict it, so you can't use that consequential thinking, and at the same time you don't really have a gut feeling looking at it, why would one be the other. You have a principle that you trust that will say, if you do it this way, you will be better off long term. Because on our principles, one of the principles we don't repeat yourself in the programming sense, because it leads to problems. And you may not be able to see in the instance you're looking at why that will be a problem. And you may not feel emotionally about either, but eventually you'll rely on that principle in that case. You'll say, well, don't repeat yourself, so therefore I'll group these things together and have them in one place. And then in practice, you come back to it 2 years later and think, it's a jolly good thing I did that. Because otherwise I'd be in a mess now. So you can sort of see that it did work. And I think the same kind of thing could be applied to moral judgment.
So I'm just trying to get my head around that. So if you find yourself repeating yourself, the thing to do is to say it once but reference it twice.
Yes,
in
a coding sense.
Yeah.
So if you have a piece of logic which solves a particular problem, and then you have a similar problem somewhere else, you don't generate a new piece of logic which solves this new problem. You extract the bit that's common to the pair and reference it in both cases. Therefore, if your understanding of the problem changes, you only have to change it in one place.
Gotcha.
And then you fix both. which is really useful in a programming. I don't know how useful it is in a moral sense, but certainly in a programming sense, it's really useful to be able to do that, because it makes the code maintainable.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, you have lots of copies of something that are slightly or subtly different, and to know which ones you've fixed and which ones you haven't, and if they're slightly out of sync with each other, you get all sorts of integration problems from a coding sense, where things don't happen as you think they should, because something's logically inconsistent underneath.
So you just use that principle.
So you have a principle that says don't repeat yourself.
Yeah.
And then you can apply that. And it's not always true. It's not like a metaphysical principle. Sometimes you have to repeat yourself. But as long as you do it with some of a certain awareness, I am repeating this piece because I need to for this reason.
It's quite a nice analogy, actually, for using different approaches, isn't it? So in general, you're using a deontological approach, but you make exceptions in particular situations when another...
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think certainly computer coding fits that model better. Whereas in a moral sense, I probably tend to use the virtue-based and the sort of, how do I feel about this decision? Because if I feel bad about it, there's probably a reason that I feel bad about that decision.
I wonder if it's got something to do with that as well, in terms of virtue ethics. It relies on our thinking fast type kind of thing. We've built up a tendency to make the right decision, use good intentions, and we use that a lot of the time. And then as soon as we can't come up against something a bit naughty, we kind of have to step back and think,
And start balancing all the different... Because I don't think you can do that quickly enough. You can't balance out all the possible consequences quickly enough. So you're relying on a kind of sort of stacked knowledge of previous instances where you've made a decision, and that gives you this gut feeling. I mean, even the simple decision of like choosing breakfast cereal type decisions, you can't lay down all of the possible breakfast cereals you could have, all the nutritional benefits of each one, all of the prices of all the different ones. By the time you've set all out that stuff, your logic and stuff to work out that decision, and the consequences of eating this one over that one, and what people will think of you, and all the other things.
You'd be pretty hungry, wouldn't you?
You'd be pretty hungry, and the shop will close, and also anyway. So you make a decision based on some kind of gut feeling of decisions you made before that didn't have bad consequences. So if you took the chocolate ones before and you got really fat and you knew that was a problem, instinctively you don't check the chocolate ones, and that's just virtue ethics based decision. I mean, it's not particularly ethics, but it's a virtue-based decision. You say, I will take the shredded wheat because that's a sort of, it's not really a principle of I will only eat grain, or I will not eat chocolate, which is more a principle-based thing. If you have trouble, you could apply a principle.
Yeah, I mean, and that also becomes part of your habit. So your ability to work through the consequences can become itself a virtue. So it's necessarily interdependent.
Yeah, I think it sort of becomes implicit. You don't have to think through the logic loops each time, because you ingrain that behaviour. Yeah, you make yourself a better person by analysing the ones that need analysing, and then relying on that judgment again and again.
Yeah.
Once you've done it once, and that happens subconsciously because you feel good about a decision. You implicitly feel that will have good consequences.